recording going. All right, tonight's shiur, as usual, Ilu Nishmat Avi Morido, Ber Meir Ben Reuven Halevi, Imi Morati Rachel Bat Harav Michael. And this Shabbos, we have the privilege of starting the second of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, Sefer Shemot. And in Sefer Shemot, we have a number of interesting things happening, but I'm going to focus primarily on the first chapter of Shemot, which deals with what I will call the beginning, the origins of the Shibud Mitzrayim, the exile in Egypt, and ultimately the slavery in Egypt, which I think is what we're all very familiar with from Pesach. We all know the storyline. I'm going to try to focus on some insights regarding the chronology and some of the events that are recorded in the beginning chapter of Shemot. So I want to start very simply with the beginning of Shemot, which is almost the first few psukim in the book of Shemot, in the parshat of Shemot, are almost a retrospective of the last couple of parshiot of Sefer Breshit, which basically brings us back to the Jews descending to Egypt, which is basically the beginning of the Galut. The Galut really begins with the Jews ending up in Egypt. And that's why the book of Shemot, which is the Sipur of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the story of the Egyptian exile and the redemption, the exodus from the Egyptian exile, begins with the Jews arriving in Egypt. So it begins with V'ela Shemot Bnei Yisrael Habayim Mitzrayim Eit Yaakov Ishavei Tovah, that when the Jewish people arrived, where they came to Egypt, they arrived as a bunch of households, a bunch of families, not a nation. There is a single person, Yaakov, who is coming down with his children and their families. That's it. It's not yet a nation. And that's why they're listed again. The tribes are listed, with the exception, of course, of Yosef in verses 2, 3, and 4, because Yosef is already there, having preceded them, as we read in verse 5. And then verse 6 tells us very simply, which we read about at the end of last week's parsha, Vayechi Vayom at Yosef, that Yosef dies. But then the verse in verse 6 adds, V'chol echav, all of his brothers died after him. V'chol hador hahu, and the entire generation passed away. And then it says, Bnei Yisrael paro vayishrutu vayirbu vayatzmu, all the Bnei Yisrael multiplied, increased very much. But Timale Haaretz Otam, such that the land was filled with them. So I focused, you'll notice, on a couple of things here. That firstly, they're Ba'im Mitzrayim, they were coming to Egypt. That's already the first stage of the exile, begins with arrival in Egypt. The second stage of the exile, which we read about last week, which the parsha here does not really allude to, is with the death of Yaakov. As we read in the beginning of Rashi, in the beginning of Parshat Vayechi. Vayechi is the only parsha in the Torah that does not begin with a new paragraph. And there, the Midrash says that the reason Vayechi does not begin with a new paragraph was because even though the Jews were living in Egypt, while Yaakov was still alive, they didn't feel that they were in exile. With the death of Yaakov, they began already to feel that they were in exile. However, that exile really doesn't begin with all of its implications until after the death of Yosef, and after the death of Yosef and all of his brothers. So I want to just, for a minute, we're going to put up a different screen just to show you some dates and times here of this thing. Wait a minute, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to share that screen. I see it, but everybody sees it. If you look very simply, I have a very, very simple chart here that just shows the life and times of the Avot. And you'll notice that Yaakov is born in the year 2108 from creation and arrives in Egypt in the year 2238 from creation. Now, that is 210 years until the Exodus. So from the time Yaakov arrives in Egypt till the Exodus is 210 years. Yaakov dies 17 years later, so there's now only 193 years left. However, Yosef does not die until year 2309, which leaves only 139 years left to the till the Exodus. So the actual period from the death of Yosef until the Jews leave Egypt is only 139 years, not the full 400 that God told Avraham Avinu would happen, but it's only 139. Now, interestingly enough, if we remember, the pasuk said that not only Yosef died, but all of his brothers died. And the last of the brothers to die was Levi, who lived to the age of 137 and died in the year 2332, which is only 116 years before the Exodus, and only 36 years before Moshe is born, because Moshe is 80 at the time of the Exodus. So if we think about it, the events that are described in the first paragraph really happen in that the rest of the first chapter of this story happens at the beginning of that period of 116 years, and really the whole period of that we're talking about is only a period, it's a lot of time, 116 years, but it's certainly significantly less than 400 years. So that's one of the things I wanted to focus on, that again, even though Yaakov arrives in Egypt 210 years before the Exodus, the first 90 of those years, Levi is still alive for the first 94 of those, and it's only when Levi, who is the last of the tribes to die, dies, that the Egyptian Exile really feel the next level, the next stage of the slavery in Egypt. So we're going to now go back to Parsha, and we'll go and see what happens after Yosef and all his brothers die. Okay, the next thing the Torah tells us very simply is Vayakam el Chadosh al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. Very, very significant phraseology here, that he did not, there was a new king in Egypt who did not yada, who did not know Joseph. Now the question is, what does that mean? That firstly, what does it mean that there was a new king? And secondly, what does it mean that he didn't know Yosef? Now the Parshanim have a problem with this, because normally, how do we get a new king? A new king arrives when the old king dies. So normally we would have expected it to say, Vayomat Melech Mitzrayim, the king died and there was a new king. But it doesn't. It says a new king arose over Egypt. So based on that, the Midrash wants to say that it really wasn't the new king. It was just the king decided he was going to change the course of the government, of the official policy toward the Jews. Because if we look in verse 9, why did he just make that decision? He was very much concerned. He had a major population demographic problem here. The Jews were multiplying at a very, very, very rapid rate, and were reaching the point where they were going to soon be more numerous, more of the population than the Egyptians. Pharaoh is concerned because his power base is not the Jews, it's the Egyptians. He is concerned that the Jews are going to rebel and do something. So he decides he has to take some action. But in order, the first action he has to take is he has to disown the good that the Jews did for the country. So his first step is he no longer recognizes Yosef. He has to now go and change the curriculum in all the schools so that nobody is teaching about how Yosef saved the country, because that's the first step to forgetting the past, is not teaching it to the next generation. So he does that by very simply removing from the Egyptian records all mention of Yosef and how he had saved the country. So that's the first step. So once we has taken that step, it's a lot easier to say, oh, the Jews, they're not citizens here, they're a bunch of strangers. Now we can get rid of them or find out ways to make them, turn them into lower class citizens. And if we look and study Jewish migration and Jewish persecution over time, we will find that the patterns set by this Pharaoh, this king of Egypt, very, very much become the norm in other countries. Jews will arrive in a country, they will flourish, they will provide all sorts of wonderful things for the country, to the point that the people now suddenly say, wait a minute, the Jews own everything, the Jews control everything, we got to get rid of them, we got to do something about it. And again, this pattern repeats itself. Now, part of it is natural jealousy. The fact that Jews go places, Hashem blesses them, they prosper, and they are able to make a difference in the country. In every country where Jews have migrated to, there was a period of time where they were welcome and they very much enhanced the country, both culturally, economically, socially, and morally, because the Jews rub off on the rest of the population. And the rest of the population doesn't necessarily want to be moralized and shown how inadequate and incompetent they are. And so they began to get jealous of the Jews. However, in this case, it seems that although there are, again, both cases, both ways, there are cases where anti-Semitism starts from the bottom and works its way up, and there are cases where anti-Semitism starts at the top and works its way down. So clearly, this example that we see here is the classic case of the leadership feeling threatened by the Jews before the general population felt threatened by the Jews. And the leadership decides it's going to take some steps to try to control the problem before it gets out of hand, or at least mitigate the problem that's already gotten out of hand, at least from that perspective. Okay, as I said, we're pretty familiar with the story. Paro decides what to do. They decide that the first step is vayasimu alav sarei misim. They establish tax collectors, tax officers. And the purpose here, again, we tend to think of taxes as money, a monetary payment that we make to a government. But in the old days, and in many of the places in the Tanakh where we have the term misim, taxes, it's a labor tax, not a tax that you pay to pay the labor you get, but it's a tax that your person, is put into labor, into forced service of the country or the king. And that is exactly what these taskmasters, these officers were set to make sure that the Jews reported to labor to work on behalf of the king. And interestingly enough, the first stage of this forced labor was at least theoretically some type of, perhaps seen as at least an honorable type of labor. Why? Because Vayiven Aremis Kanot of Paro. The first thing they did was they built storage cities for Paro. So they felt, okay, they could be paid, they could at least say, okay, we're being patriotic, we're doing government service, we're building on behalf of Paro. It's a very good way to live our lives. What else do we have to do? The government is supporting us, so we're okay. However, in verse 12, as the next stage, the more they afflicted the Jews by making them work for Paro, the population did not stop exploding. And they became tired of, they became totally enamored by not enamored in a positive sense, in a negative sense, with the Jewish people. By Yakutsu, the word coats, as they appeared, the Jewish people appeared to them like they were sticking them. They were thorns in their sides. So the word Vayakutsu, from coats being a sharp object, they were stung perhaps by the Jewish people, is the best way to translate Vayakutsu. Okay, and the next stage, so in other words, even though originally the original labor was laboring for Paro, they reached a point where that wasn't enough, and Vayavidu Mitzrayim et Bnei Yisrael b'farach, that all of the Egyptians are now able to enslave any Jew any way they wanted, make them do any labor they wanted for them, and basically the Jews now became a lower class, a lower caste of servants whose only job was to serve the population. But that, again, was not enough. As we read further on, as I said, we're very familiar with from the Pesach story, they embittered them with all sorts of harsh labor, chomer of vilvanim, mortar and bricks, all work of the field. So in other words, at this point, the Egyptians felt that they could individually, not just collectively on behalf of the government, enslave the Jews, but each Egyptian could individually enslave any Jew he chose to enslave. However, this in itself also seems to be not enough for Paro. He has to go further. And we know, of course, the story beginning in verse 15. The king now speaks to the midwives, and the midwives, interestingly, it tells us the names of two of them. One was named Shifra, one was named Pu'ah. And we're probably familiar with the midrash that says these two were Yocheved and Miriam, which we'll get to in a minute. But Paro decides that there's only one way to stop the population growth, and that is infanticide. Or not necessarily infanticide, but more like a forced abortion. And he says to these mialdot, the midwives, that when you see that the woman is about to give birth, check and see if before it comes out, before it's emerged, while it's still in the womb, if you see that it's a boy, kill it. And if it's a girl, you can let it live. Obviously, we know, of course, the midwives, it says the pasuk specifically tells us that the reason they didn't do it, not because they were paid off, but vatireno hamialdot et holokim, that the mialdot, these women who were the midwives, feared God. They had fear of God. Now, it's interesting, this whole concept of tirena et halokim, or what we call yirat shamayim, or fear of heaven, fear or awe of God. This is not the first time that we've seen this phrase in the context of not necessarily the Jews, but here it's referring to them in their relationship to the Egyptians. We've had it similarly with Avimelech saying that talking to Abraham, how could you do this? We're God-fearing people. We have it similarly in other cases where somebody is described as a God-fearing person, not necessarily Jewish, but we're going to get into a discussion in a few minutes who these midwives were and why the Torah is going through this whole story of the midwives as a significant part of the period leading up to the birth of Moshe. So this is a very significant part. It takes not one pasuk or two psukim, but Torah gives 7 whole psukim to the story of the midwives, and it tells us that they did not listen to Paro, and the king calls them and says, "Why didn't you do it?" And they answer because they give an excuse that the women are too fertile. They give birth by themselves. They don't even need us. And then in verse 20, it tells us that God did good for these midwives. And as a result, the people multiplied and became very strong. Now, in verse 21, it tells us further, because the mialdot feared God, somebody made for them houses. We're going to have a chance to get into that also. And then ultimately, we know, of course, that Paro orders everybody, you load all the sons, every son that is born, must be thrown into the river, but every daughter you're allowed to live. So we're going to now try to go and delve into this whole story of the beginning phases of the exile in Egypt, ranging from, as I said, first servitude, then outright slavery, then attempted infanticide, and then actual infanticide. So let's go through each of these stages, and we'll try to develop some insights into each of them. We're going to start, of course, as we usually do, with Rashi. And Rashi, this is not a Rashi in our parsha. This is actually a Rashi in next week's parsha, but it explains the concept that I had in the chart of the fact that the actual slavery, the actual exile, the harsh part of the exile in Egypt did not happen until the death of Levi. And Rashi brings this down when it lists next week's parsha, when it lists the tribe of Levi and it lists the families in terms of the genealogy of Moshe and Aaron. It tells us that Levi lived to the age of 137. Now, other than the fact that the Torah tells us that Yosef died at the age of 110, Levi is the only other one of the tribes who we know how old he was when he died. The others we can surmise, but we don't know. The Torah only mentions it with Levi, and Rashi wants to ask, based on the Midrash, Lama nimnu shnotav shel Levi. Why did the Torah have to give us a count, a definitive number of how long Levi lived? Lodia kama yemei hashibur, to tell us how long the actual exile was. Shekol zman shechad min hashvatim kayam lo haya shibud, because as long as one of the tribal ancestors was alive, there was no enslavement yet in Egypt. Shenemar, as we said in ours, I just said above, Ayamat Yosef v'chol echav. It was only after Yosef and all of his brothers died, and then Vayakam Melech Chadash, that the new king started this whole series of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish decrees. The Levi Harich Yamim Al Kulam. Since Levi was the one who was the last to die, the Torah lists how long he lived. And that's the basis of the chart that I showed before. And Sifsei Chachamim goes into it a little bit more. Basically, again, very similar to what we had in the chart. So he says, based on this chronology of Levi's death, that the entire slavery part of the exile in Egypt was only 116 years. So Yosef, and now he proves it because Yosef was 30 years when he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. And at that point, we know that Levi was 34 because all of Yaakov's sons, with the exception of Binyamin, were born within a 6-year period. Because there were two. Levi was not born until 2 years within that 7-year period. The 6-year period, excuse me, because the 6-year period began, actually, it's the 7-year period that Yaakov was working for Rachel. During that period of time, all of the children of Yaakov were born with the exception of Binyamin. And since obviously the first child wasn't born until he was married for almost a year, here Sisacham mentioned 6 years. 6 of those 7 years, there was the period during which all of the tribes were born. And since Levi was the third, he must have been born in the 3rd year of the 7, which was the 2nd year of the 6th year of the children being born. Shu Gimel Reuven, he was the 3rd child after Reuven and Shimon. So we see, based on this chronology, that Levi was 4 years older than Yosef. And we know that Yosef was 30 when he arrived in Egypt. Therefore, Levi was 34 when Yosef arrived in Egypt. And since they arrived Yosef was 30 when he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, not when he arrived in Egypt. He was 17 when he arrived in Egypt. And it was 9 years after that, after the 7 years of plenty, and they were in the 2nd year of the famine when Yaakov and his family arrived. So we see, based on that, that Levi was 43 years old. So if he died at 137, minus 43 that he was when he arrived there, that says that he survived 94 more years, and we take 94 from 210, we get 116. So the Siddhachamim goes through the entire chronology and what it's based on that I showed you in the chart before. Okay, having said all that, we now reach the point where the Paro goes through all of the different stages of slavery, and ultimately he calls the midwives. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the whole story with the midwives. Okay, so Rashi very simply brings the midrashic interpretation that Shifra and Pu'ah were actually 2 individuals. One is Yocheved, Moshe's mother, and she was called Shifra because she was the one who would improve, she would improve the birthing process. In other words, she was an expert in helping the mother through the birthing process. And Pu'ah is Miriam, her daughter, who was the one who would take the child after birth and prepare it, make sure it came out healthy, and did all the things that had to be done for the baby after the birth. So in other words, there were 2 of them, they worked together. One helped the mother, one was with the mother and attended upon the mother. The other took the baby and attended to the baby. So each one had their specialty, and they worked as a pair. Rashbam similarly says the same. Now, Rashbam similarly just says very simply, Lamiyaldot ha'ivriot. Now, the word Lamiyaldot ha'ivriot means the midwives, the Jewish. And we have 2 ways of looking at that as we're going to go through the Parshanim. Rashbam says that simple translation is the miyaldot shehem ivriyot. The midwives were Jewish women who assisted the other Jewish women who were giving birth. And that's one, as I said, one school of thought, which Rashi obviously has adopted from the Midrash, that they were Jewish women. The midwives were Jewish women. Okay. Now, Ibn Ezra says, no, that Shifra and Puah were not necessarily the midwives exclusively. Okay. The king of Egypt spoke to the miyaldot, to the midwives. He says, Ibn Ezra says, no. Sarot hayu al kol hamiyaldot. Shifra and Puah were not the only two midwives. They were the two heads of the midwives' union, guild, group, whatever you want to call it. Okay, in other words, they were the liaison between the midwives as a profession and the government. There's no doubt that they had to have at least 500 midwives for their population size. They were the ones who were appointed head of the midwives. They had to collect the taxes from the midwives for their service. So they were just the ones who were in charge of collecting the taxes from the midwives. So therefore they had, I guess, the ear of the king, or the king had their ear, because they came to deliver the taxes to the government. And by the way, Ibn Ezra says, even in his time, the midwives' guild had a leader, had a head or heads who were responsible to the government for paying the taxes or the fees or whatever, or the registration fees or whatever you want to call them, for the entire guild of the midwives. Now, here he says, he says, he quotes the Midrash that says it was a mother and her daughter. That's possible that the two of them would have been related since they worked together. Where you would need the two of them working together. It makes sense that they would have been related because they would have had a good working relationship, although I'm not so sure how true that is, that people who are related have good working relationships. But at least Ibn Ezra seems to think that, and perhaps in antiquity that was much more the case, that people would choose somebody who they fully trusted because they were related to them to work with, rather than some outsider. So that would make sense. Okay, Bechor Shor also says basically that, quotes the Midrash, that but he also adds very simply that Hiskir HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shmam Lichvodan, that the Torah specifically mentions Shifra and Puah by name to give them honor, because they risked their lives. Tizkaron L'tov, they should be remembered for good. Samu Nafsham B'chapam Al Yisrael Lavor Mitzvat HaMelech. They basically took their lives in their hands on behalf of the Jewish people and ignored the king's command. They basically flat out refused to do what the king asked them to do. By obviously doing that, they were taking their lives in their hand, and therefore they get a specific mention in the Torah by name as those who should be remembered for good. That's why it specifically mentions their name. Now, Sforno agrees basically with Ibn Ezra. It's impossible that there were only two midwives, but he gives a slightly different twist to who these two were. He says, Li'otan Shahayu Be'ir Mitzrayim. These two midwives in the capital city, in the city where the Pharaoh lived, there were only two Jewish midwives, probably because most of the Jews lived in Goshen. They did not live in the capital city. So in the capital, there was probably a very small Jewish presence, probably dating back to when Yosef was still there. So there was probably a small Jewish presence. They only needed two midwives. It was a small, very small Jewish community. Because it's obviously certain that for such a large nation, there weren't only two midwives. Now, why did he start with those two? Because he wanted to see, Sforno says, he started with those two to see how well this idea was going to work. Lo samli bo leave talk me al do mekomod. He says, hey, these two who live right here, who I can keep an eye on, didn't want to pay attention to me. How am I going to ever enforce this with all the other ones? And I'm not even going to bother. So basically, they were the trailblazers, according to Sforno, by ignoring or disobeying the king. They set the precedent so that Paro didn't even try to enlist other midwives. Now, perhaps he might have had some success. We don't know. All we know is, at least based on Sforno, that his opinion is that Paro didn't even bother trying. Once he had abject and complete failure with these two, he didn't even bother trying again. So it's an interesting shot as fact how were there only two mialdot for the entire Jewish people. Okay. Kleakar goes into the discussion again, and he brings the contrarian opinion. As I said, the Midrashic opinion was they were Jewish women. B, not only were they Jewish women, they were well-known Jewish women, Yocheved and Miriam. But Kleakar brings down the contrarian opinion, which is also brought down by Barbanel. We're going to see later. Yesh omrim shema yaldot hayu mitzriyot. These midwives were not Jewish women at all. Not only were they not Yocheved and Miriam, they were not Jewish women at all. They were Egyptian women. Uki'ilu amar, and the pasuk would say, yaldot et ha'ivriot, that Paro is speaking to the Egyptian women whose rounds, whose clientele were Jewish women. To im locain, because if you want to assume that these midwives were Jewish, my revute de kamara tirano elokim. What does the Torah want to add to teach us by saying these midwives feared God? How do we know they feared God? You know, if they were Jewish, they just saved people because they didn't want to kill their compatriots. However, if they were Egyptian, then it makes sense that the only reason they didn't want to carry out Paro's order was because they were responsible to a higher authority, and they knew they were responsible to higher authority, and that's why it says they feared God. So it makes a lot more sense to say that these midwives were non-Jewish midwives whose clientele was Jewish. Therefore, we might have expected them to go along with Pharaoh's plot, but they chose not to. And I think there's a very, very powerful lesson from this Kleakar. In times of persecution, anti-Semitism, or anti-anything else, we have to realize that discriminating against anybody for anything really is going against God's will, because we're all created in the image of God. And if we properly fear God, we will take a stand when people are being mistreated, whether they are our brothers, they are our family, whether they are our co-religionists or co-countrymen, or they are just human beings. And I think that's the lesson that Kleakar wants us to get out of this story with the Mialdot, because the whole point of the story is that they defied the king at risk of their own lives to save somebody who they didn't really have a connection with and could have just said, oh, well, I was just following orders. That's not a legitimate answer. When God's moral laws are being broken, we can't just say, oh, okay, well, somebody made me do it. That's not a legitimate excuse, and that's what Kleakar is focusing us on. Then the Kleakar, by the way, does quote Chazal that says that they were Yocheved and Miriam. But it's interesting. He wants to suggest that the reason they didn't do what Paro's, the reason they did not listen to Paro was not so much that, even though the Torah says the reason they didn't do it, if we're talking about the Jewish women, if they were Jewish women, if Shifra and Pua were really Yocheved and Miriam, then possibly the reason they did not listen to Paro was not necessarily because they feared God, but more so because they believed that God was going to bring the redemption, that God was going to redeem the Jewish people, and they did not want the Jewish people to die out. Because had they believed, if they had any doubt that God was going to redeem the Jewish people, they could have said, oh, let's do what Paro suggests. Why should we subject these children to being born and growing up to lives of misery and slavery? Why don't we just kill them now and save them, these children, all of that agony and pain and trouble? But because they believed that God was going to eventually redeem the Jewish people, therefore they continued their work and making sure the babies lived and were healthy and grew strong. So again, a different aspect, a way of looking at these midwives, not necessarily only because it was the correct moral thing to do, but it also gave all of the Jewish people a lesson and chizuk and strength in their belief that, yes, this was only a temporary situation. When we are in exile, it's only a temporary situation, no matter what exile we find ourselves in, whether it's the Egyptian exile, the Babylonian exile, the Roman exile, the Persian exile, whatever it might be, it is only a temporary situation, and God can bring about our salvation at a moment's notice. So we should never, ever give up hope. And we talked about that last week in terms of Yaakov leaving that message to his children on his deathbed, that don't lose hope. God is with us, and he will eventually and ultimately redeem us. So we see that this tradition clearly carried on to these midwives if we go with the second approach of Kleakar, that the midwives were Jewish women. As I said, if we go back to the first one, clearly a very different lesson that we learned from the midwives. Okay, finally, we're going to get to Abarbanel, and just a couple of comments that Abarbanel makes, which I thought were very, very impressive. Again, Abarbanel, firstly, it's interesting that Paro, despite the fact that he is willing to commit, again, as I said, forced abortion or infanticide, he wants to do it b'tzina u'b'seser. Even though he's talking to the midwives, he talks only to the midwives privately. Even Paro realizes that to go out and issue a decree to kill all these Jews who have come to dwell in his land is not an appropriate thing to do. Interesting that Abarbanel puts this, even Paro, who's trying to destroy the Jewish people, realizes that he has to do it kind of under the table rather than open and out in the open. For a couple of reasons. Because even Noachides, in other words, it's a universal law that we don't go around murdering innocent people. That's a moral law. That's part of God's moral law, and therefore it's one of the 7 universal commandments. And even Paro recognizes that we don't go around openly and wantonly just killing innocent people. Therefore, he spoke to the midwives, and you have to look before the birth, okay? They have to secretly figure out if it's a son before it's born and kill it. You can easily do it if he suggests here that they should strangle the baby as it's coming out so that it should never be born. Although one of the parshanim later on, I forgot who, says that no, what Paro was suggesting is that they abort them before they're born if it's a boy. Since abortion is not actually, even though it is tantamount to murder, it's not quite the same from a full moral perspective because a fetus hasn't yet been born, whereas once the baby has emerged from the birth canal, it's already a full-born human being. So if you kill him before it emerges from the birth canal, that's not as bad, and maybe you'll be willing to go on with that, okay? And that's why the Medrash suggests that Paro gave them a sign to know whether it's a boy or a girl. If it's and Now, interestingly enough, Abarbanel has another very interesting thing. Why did Paro choose to kill the boys and leave the girls alive? I would have thought exactly the opposite, because if you want to make sure that there's no next generation, you kill all the women. Because if you don't have women, you can't have babies. Guys can't make babies without women. Not that women can make babies without men, but all you don't need is many men. And that's exactly what the Abarbanel is going to say. Okay, Paro wanted to kill the males so that the women would be left. If the women marry Egyptian men, they'll have lots more Egyptian babies. Their babies will be half Egyptian, and these women will become assimilating into the Egyptian culture if there are no Jewish men to marry. The Amnam the males will not, they'll be slightly different. What was he worried about with the males? He was more worried about the men because he was concerned that the men were going to form an army and fight against him. Therefore, he didn't care about the women, because women don't join armies. Certainly not back in antiquity. Women were not fighters in armies. So therefore, he is concerned with manpower manning an armed force. He is not concerned with the women. And that's why, so two reasons. One, he figured if the women were left with no Jewish men to marry, they would have to marry Egyptians and would ultimately melt into Egyptian society. But more so, he was concerned that the males would form a military force of rebellion and rebel against the Egyptians. Okay. Now he goes back to the other half of the question. How can there only have been two midwives? So he says the following. It's impossible to think that there were only two midwives. Jewish people, when they leave Egypt, are 600,000 strong adult males. So their population was probably, at least 3-4 times that when they left Egypt. How could two midwives, serve that many people? So therefore, we have to assume they were Elisarot Hamyaldot Kulan. They were the officers of the midwives, the leaders of the midwives guild. Kedivrei hafarshim ki hayuroi sheikarim kakotuv sarot hamiyaldot. Kemosara mashkim, Masara ofim, Masara tabachim. Just like all of Paro's officers were called the officer of the who poured, the chief butler, the chief baker, the chief this. Why weren't they the chief? The pasuk should have called them the chief midwives if they were indeed the midwives. Gam kima ho'il Paro b'takanatol l'davar zeh l'sherot ha'hena. The Sarot Ha'eno, Im Lo Yitzaveh came Lemishmartot Shalahem. What good was Paro telling these two women, if they are indeed only the officers who are in charge of these two guilds, the midwives guilds, telling them isn't going to stop the babies from being born unless they tell all of the midwives. So he says, he's brought down two possibilities. One, there were only two midwives. He says that's impossible. Then he brings down the opinion that these two were the two leaders of the midwives guild. He said that's also hard to believe because they would have had to communicate this to the entire midwives guild, and we don't find that Paro says you got to tell all the other midwives this. So that doesn't make sense. So what Abarbanel wants to say is that I understand that there are those who say that there were only two midwives. I understand those that say these were the two chief midwives. But here's what it really is. He says, Inyan Kachu, this is really what Shahaya Minad b'Mitzrayim, Shayubot Shnayim V'Yaldot Lamodim Kol Isha Shayta Yoledet. The Egyptian protocol for childbirth was that there were two attendant midwives for each pregnancy. One's job was to attend the birth, in other words, by attending to the mother during the birth. Nikrat Shifra al Shem Shemishaperet et Havlad, because her job was to make sure that the baby came out okay, that the birth exit through the birth canal, the child did not get deformed during the birthing process. This was called the Shifra job. Okay, that was the job of one of the two women who would go to every birth. Vashenit, he asakal hachazik bioledet uliozra bidvarim v'kolot utfilot. The second one's job was to strengthen the woman. In other words, not to deal with the baby coming through the birth canal, but to deal with the woman and her labor pains. So she was basically the Lamaze coach, was the second one. To help her through words and kolot and sounds, utfilo and prayer. So she was the one who was helping the mother emotionally get through the pains of labor. She was the second one was called Pua. I will go through the pangs like a childbirth, Okay, the Amar Shadiba Paralimi Aldono Ivriyod, Rata Loma Likulana. So all of the midwives had an audience with Paro, all of both groups. In other words, each of these two, and each pair of midwives, one was the specialty who dealt with the mother, one was the specialty who dealt with watching the child through the birth canal. So there were two different specialties within the midwives guild, and so Paro had an audience with all of them. Shifra, Paro met with all of them. The pasuk doesn't say that Paro met with the two miyaldot. It says the miyaldot. He spoke to all of them from both groups. The tziva zu. They had two specialties. The zesh amru sheshema chad shifra v'shema sheni pua. He said that one of the specialties was called the shifra specialty. The other specialty was called the pua specialty. The lo hayu ivriot. They were not Jewish women. All of the midwives in the Egyptian Midwives Guild were not Jewish. They were non-Jewish women. How could Paro have had any imagination that Jewish women would kill Jewish babies? So the fact is, the midwives, A, had to be Egyptian. B, there weren't only two of them. There were two groups of them, two specialties within them. And that's why Paro spoke to all of them. So the job of the midwives, these Egyptian women, were the midwives who were responsible in the Jewish sector, and that is who Paro invited to the palace, had this audience with, told them all his plan. Now, there were all of these midwives. It wasn't just two women. Even though they were Egyptian women, Yaru et Elokim, they all were God-fearing, and they did not listen to what Paro requested of them to do. And he ultimately said, "Hey, I don't get what's going on, and why." And then they came up with the answer that Paro was concerned. It wasn't enough that they didn't kill them. Not only did the midwives not do what Paro asked, they were even more diligent in their duties in making sure that the kids came out healthy, because they didn't want any suspicion attached to themselves. So it wasn't enough that they didn't listen to Paro, but they tried their best to thwart him. Okay? And what did they answer? And they had to answer, the answer, the excuse they gave to Paro was, you shouldn't think that, yes, we know when we go to an Egyptian home, we got to do everything. These Egyptian women, they don't know anything about childbirth. They know nothing, and whatever we tell them to do, they do, and everything goes fine. But the Jewish women, they don't. They know they know what's going on. They're educated. We can't just pull the wool over their eyes. We won't fool them. That was the excuse they gave to Paro. They are much more alive and aware of what's going on, and that was the excuse they gave Paro for why they did not kill the children. So we see from this whole story that as I said, it doesn't take a Jew to be a God-fearing person and to realize that there are certain things that are morally abhorrent to any God, regardless of whether you believe in God or in a God or multiple gods. There are certain things that are inappropriate. And I think these are just some of the many, many lessons that we have in the opening parsha of Shemot. As I said, that we even as we are going into an exile that's going to last, again, not necessarily 400 years, not necessarily 210 years, but only 116 years. Nonetheless, we have to always keep our eyes on Hashem, and that He is the one who is ultimately going to redeem us, no matter how far we have sunken into the depths of the exile. We can never lose faith that the redemption is right around the corner, and we hope and pray that we will. That's one of the most important lessons that we can learn from this week's parsha, that yes, Hashem cares about how we live our lives, what we do, no matter who we are and where we are in His world. God has created all of us in His image to be aware of Him so that we can grow, and that we, the Jewish people, are the ones who are supposed to be the pace setters, the trendsetters, the ones who are showing the whole world how to live a godlike life, so that ultimately we will merit the ultimate redemption. Thank you all for joining. I open it up now to comments, questions, and feedback.
I have
Rita.
It sounds like a Roe versus Wade argument in the of how they're going to kill the infants and when and so forth, and if it's living or if it's murder.
Yeah. Again, there's a whole discussion in the halakhic literature in terms of what constitutes a halakhically valid abortion versus a halakhically illegal, improper abortion. And generally, it's generally very simply a mother's life takes precedence over the baby's life until the instant that the baby emerges from the birth canal. Okay, as long as that baby is still inside the mother's body, the mother's life takes precedence over the baby's life if you can only save one. And not only that, but even if the baby, as long as the baby is in the womb, it is not its own entity. Okay, it is part of the mother. However, that doesn't give the mother permission to abort the baby unless the baby is threatening the mother's physical or mental well-being. Okay, so now you notice I added the word or mental. Okay, so again, as long as it's not yet emerged, it's still considered a fetus. And once that head or any part, once either the majority part of the baby or its head has emerged from the mother's through the birth canal, then it is now its own entity, and it has the same halachot as the mother in terms of saving its life. Until it's born, if you have to kill the baby to save the mother, you can. Once it's born, you can't. Okay?
But that isn't I don't see that as the issue. The issue is when if you abort a baby, are you or even a fetus at 3 months or 6 months?
The answer is no. The answer is you cannot wantonly, haphazardly abort a baby. According to halacha, once the baby has reached the stage of I don't want to say 3 months, but again, yeah, once you finish the first trimester, The baby has been formed already. It's a baby. It's a living, breathing, beating human being from a halakhic perspective. However, that baby is not a full-fledged human being until it emerges. So to the extent that it is not harming anybody else or threatening anybody else, you have to allow it to continue to grow. The only time you're allowed to perform an abortion under Torah law is if the mother's health is being threatened. Okay, we can't wantonly. You're not halachically. Abortion is not allowed at first trimester, second trimester, third trimester. Okay,
that I understand, but the way it was put here that they should check the baby.
Oh, Paro is trying to phrase it as an abortion rather than a murder to assuage his conscience. That's all he's trying to do. In other words, he's telling them, if you kill it before it's born, it's not murder. It is murder, and that's what they understood. But he's trying, it's lahavdil. It's the same as the women who say, it's my body, my baby. I don't care if it's 8 months pregnant. I can kill the baby anytime I want. I birthed him. It's my baby. It's my body. I can kill him as long as he's in my body. The answer is no. Unless, as I said, the baby is threatening the mother's life, health, or life, the baby cannot be aborted just because the mother feels that they want to get rid of the baby. Any more than after you can go and kill your 2-year-old son and leave him out on a mountaintop because you don't want the kid anymore. Okay, so there's Paros is trying to assuage his own conscience because he's sitting here and telling people, I want you to commit murder on my behalf. But he doesn't want to call it murder. He wants just like the whole reason that again he disowns Joseph and all that he did, and is that's part of the process of dehumanizing the Jewish people. Just like what was the whole purpose that Hitler wanted numbers on people? Because he didn't want you to have a name. Once you don't have a name, you're not a person. You're just a number. Okay, you're one of the vermin. You're one of the numbers. Once I've classified you as a not a human anymore, it's a lot easier for me to kill you. Just from a morality perspective, we go about, we kill animals every day for food, for whatever reason. Okay, and that's okay, and it is okay because Hashem says yes, you can kill animals, but you can't kill human beings, even if you need food. Okay, you can't just go and say, oh, I'll have a human steak today. We can't do that. We don't do that. So but again, there are different levels and stages of what people are willing to accept and people are willing to do. So again, mass murderers who want to get people involved in this mass murder have to make it palatable to the rest of to their followers. Just like how do you get people to blow themselves up and kill innocent bystanders? By selling them on the theory that these innocent bystanders are really armed, they're an army that you're fighting against, or by telling them that, well, these people are not innocent, these are not innocent bystanders, these are just bugs you're killing. Okay, so mass murderers, people who want to engage in that, have ways of selling their mass murder. And that's exactly what Paro was trying to do. Okay? Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Rita. Okay, if no other questions, comments, I wish everybody a good evening, a good rest of the week. And Best Hashem, next week, I hope I'll be back in Jimry for those who'd like to join me back in Shul, and those who are on Zoom or happy on Zoom. Best Hashem, we'll see you next week on Zoom also. Take good care, Laila Tov, and we'll be in touch. Take good care. Bye-bye all.